$3 million. That's roughly what those people ended up spending after they decided my ranch was too ugly to look at. The funny thing is, none of it started because of money. It started because a handful of wealthy homeowners couldn't stand being reminded of what their land looked like before they arrived. My name is Wyatt Mercer. I'm 53 years old, and for most of my life I've lived outside a small town in northern New Mexico called Red Mesa. My father ran cattle there before me, and his father before him. We never got rich from it. Truth is, most years we were just one bad drought away from having a very uncomfortable conversation with a bank. But it was home, 36 acres of open land, an old green barn with peeling paint, horses that always seemed smarter than people, and enough wind to make every fence post sing at night. About 10 years ago, everything around us started changing. Developers discovered the area. Suddenly people from Albuquerque, Phoenix, Dallas, and places even farther away were buying property because they wanted what the brochures called authentic Southwestern living. What they really wanted was a luxury neighborhood with mountain views and just enough ranch scenery to feel rustic without having to smell a cow. That's how Mesa Ridge Estates showed up next door. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Folks moved in, built expensive homes, planted decorative trees that looked completely confused about being in the desert, and mostly kept to themselves. But after a while, I noticed something. Every complaint coming from that neighborhood somehow pointed in my direction. Too much dust. Too much equipment visible. Barn doesn't match community character. Livestock odors affecting outdoor enjoyment. I wish I were making that last one up. Most of the complaints came from the HOA president, a woman named Victoria Crane. Now, Victoria had one of those smiles that looked professional right up until you noticed her eyes weren't participating. She sold luxury real estate, drove a black Range Rover, and spoke about community standards the way some people talk about religion. Every month, their HOA newsletter found a new way to describe my ranch without actually mentioning my name. Visual deterioration adjacent to premium properties. Agricultural clutter impacting neighborhood presentation. Unmanaged rural aesthetics. I remember reading one copy and laughing so hard coffee came out of my nose. Unmanaged rural aesthetics. Lady, that's called dirt. For years I ignored it. That's the thing about ranch life. You learn pretty quickly that arguing with every fool who dislikes you is a full-time job. I had fences to repair, calves to vaccinate, water lines to maintain. The opinions of people who paid somebody else to mow their grass didn't rank very high on my priority list. But looking back now, I think Victoria mistook silence for weakness. And that's usually where these stories begin. The morning everything changed started at 5:38 a.m. I remember the exact time because I glanced at the clock when the noise woke me up. At first I thought it was thunder. Then I realized thunder doesn't stay in one place. The sound kept coming. Loud, aggressive, metal chewing through wood. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my jacket, and stepped outside into that blue-gray light right before sunrise. The air smelled cold and dry, and for a second everything looked normal. Then I saw movement near the northern property line. 3 trucks, a wood chipper, several men in reflective vests, and chainsaws. Lots of chainsaws. My stomach dropped before my brain even caught up. I started walking fast, then jogging, then running. By the time I reached the fence line, nearly half of my cedar barrier was already on the ground. Those weren't decorative trees. They stretched almost 300 feet along the edge of my property. I planted them myself nearly 15 years earlier after a bad storm season. Every one of them had survived droughts, wildfires nearby, and more winters than I could count. Now they were being shredded into piles of branches and sawdust. One worker looked at me and immediately stopped cutting. Another pointed toward a laminated notice attached to a stump, like somehow paperwork made destruction acceptable. I tore it off and read it. Community View Restoration Project. I actually read it twice because my brain refused to believe those words existed. Community View Restoration Project. Like they were heroes in a documentary. Then I heard tires crunching across gravel. A black Range Rover rolled up behind the work crew. Victoria stepped out wearing sunglasses despite the fact the sun wasn't even fully up yet. She looked around at the fallen trees and smiled. Actually smiled. "Good morning, Wyatt," she said. "I know this may seem sudden, but residents have been concerned about losing the canyon view for years. We decided it was time to resolve the issue professionally. Professionally. I looked at the destroyed trees, then back at her. For a moment, I couldn't even find words. But Victoria wasn't finished. She crossed her arms and delivered the sentence that would end up costing her neighborhood a fortune. Frankly, she said, your property has been hurting surrounding home values for years. And standing there among 15 years of ruined cedar trees, with sawdust floating through the morning light, I felt something strange happen. I stopped being angry, because all at once I remembered something she clearly didn't know. Something buried deep inside a stack of legal paperwork sitting in a filing cabinet back of my barn. And the second that memory surfaced, I realized Victoria Crane had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. I didn't say another word to Victoria that morning. Didn't yell. Didn't threaten anybody. Didn't even ask the workers to stop. I just folded that ridiculous notice, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and walked back toward the barn while chainsaws kept roaring behind me. Now, if you've spent enough years working ranch land, you learn something most people never do. Emotions are expensive. Anger feels good for about 5 minutes. Then it starts costing you money. So, instead of getting angry, I got curious. Back in my office, I pulled open an old gray filing cabinet that had probably survived 3 generations of bad decisions. Somewhere near the bottom sat a thick folder labeled Mesa Ridge Development Access Agreement. I found it, set on the desk, and started reading. About 10 minutes later, I was laughing so hard I had to take my glasses off. Because there it was. Section 8, Paragraph C, the clause nobody apparently bothered to read. When Mesa Ridge Estates was approved years earlier, county planners discovered the development had a problem. The neighborhood didn't have a proper secondary emergency access route connecting to State Highway 142. The only practical option required crossing a narrow strip of my land along the western edge of the ranch. I agreed to it because I wasn't interested in fighting the project. But the agreement came with conditions. Very specific conditions. One of them involved the cedar barrier. Environmental consultants had determined those trees helped redirect wildlife movement away from residential property. As long as the barrier remained intact, animals naturally traveled north toward open grazing land instead of wandering into backyards. The wording was crystal clear. Destruction or removal of designated environmental barriers by the grantee, HOA representatives, contractors, or associated parties would immediately suspend access privileges pending restoration approved by the landowner. Approved by the landowner. Not the county. Not a judge. Not an HOA board. Me. I sat there staring at those words for a long time. Then I made 3 phone calls. First to my attorney, Randall Pierce. Randall had represented ranchers longer than I'd been shaving. When I explained what happened, he was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, Wyatt, please tell me they put this in writing. I held up the community view restoration notice and laughed. Oh, they absolutely did. His response was immediate. Don't touch anything. Take pictures. Take video. Document every tree. Second call went to the county access office. Third call went to a local contractor who specialized in agricultural security gates. By lunchtime, wheels were already turning. The next morning, a truck rolled onto my property carrying one of the ugliest gates I'd ever seen. Massive steel frame, concrete anchors, industrial locking mechanism. The thing looked less like a ranch gate and more like something protecting nuclear launch codes. I loved it instantly. By 7:15 a.m., it was installed directly across the easement road, right where Mesa Ridge's emergency access crossed my property. Then I hung a simple sign. Private access suspended pending easement review, nothing dramatic. Just facts. Around 7:40, the first luxury SUV rolled up. The driver stopped, stared, backed up, pulled forward again, like maybe the gate would disappear if he checked twice. 10 minutes later, there were 6 vehicles waiting. Then 10. Then 15. People started getting out. Coffee cups in hand. Business clothes. Gym clothes. Confused expressions. The traffic line stretched farther every minute. At 8:12 a.m., Victoria arrived, and she was moving fast. Her Range Rover practically skidded to a stop. The driver's door flew open before the engine even shut off. "What is this?" she shouted. I happened to be leaning against a fence post drinking coffee. Honestly, it was excellent coffee. which made the moment even better. I handed her a copy of the agreement. The highlighted section practically glowed. She skimmed it, stopped, read it again, this time slower, and I watched confidence drain from her face. You can't do this. I shrugged. Actually, I can. This road is critical emergency access. Not anymore. You'll be sued. Maybe. You'll lose. Maybe not. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to throw the paperwork at me. Instead, she pointed toward the gate. Remove it. I took another sip of coffee. No. That single word seemed to hit harder than any argument could have. Because people like Victoria expect resistance. They know how to fight. What they don't know how to handle is certainty. She drove away furious. But the real trouble hadn't even started yet. The first weekend passed quietly. Too quietly. Then Saturday evening arrived. Around sunset, I noticed movement beyond the northern pasture. At first, it was just a few elk. Nothing unusual. Then more appeared. Then even more. By dark, entire groups were moving toward Mesa Ridge. And suddenly I remembered exactly why environmental consultants wanted those cedar trees protected. The barrier wasn't there to make my property look pretty. It was there to influence migration patterns. Without it, wildlife followed the easiest available route, straight into the subdivision. The first phone call started around 9 that night. By midnight, things had become downright entertaining. One homeowner reported elk eating decorative landscaping worth thousands of dollars. Another called security because several animals had settled on a golf cart path. One particularly large bull elk apparently discovered somebody's imported rose garden and treated it like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Security footage later made its way around town. One resident stood on his patio in a bathrobe banging a metal pan with a wooden spoon while yelling things that definitely weren't approved by the HOA. The elk ignored him completely. I watched the video 3 times. It somehow got funnier every viewing. But the funniest part came Sunday morning. My friend Earl called around 7. You watching this? Watching what? Turn on channel 12. So I did. The local news helicopter was filming Mesa Ridge Estates. From the air, it looked like wildlife had officially taken ownership. Elk, javelinas, even a few mule deer. Everywhere. The reporter described it as an unusual wildlife event. I nearly choked on my coffee. Unusual? No. Entirely predictable. Victoria's property suffered the worst damage. Word spread fast. Thousands of dollars in imported plants gone. Decorative shrubs destroyed. Fresh mulch scattered across the yard. Apparently, nature wasn't impressed by HOA landscaping standards. Monday morning brought a new level of panic. Delivery companies started complaining about the detour. School traffic backed up for miles. Maintenance contractors arrived late. Service appointments got canceled. Residents who once worried about property aesthetics suddenly cared a lot more about convenience. Then came a moment everything changed. An ambulance responding to a medical emergency inside Mesa Ridge experienced a significant delay because of the rerouting situation. Thankfully, the patient survived. But once that story spread through the neighborhood, the mood shifted instantly. People stopped being annoyed. Now they were angry, and anger needs someone to blame. For years, Victoria had been the face of authority. Now she became the face of consequences. Homeowners started asking questions. Who approved the tree removal? Who reviewed the easement agreement? Who authorized contractors? Who signed off on this? The answers all pointed in one direction. And for the first time since I'd known her, Victoria Crane wasn't controlling the narrative anymore. She was trapped inside it. By Tuesday evening, emergency HOA meetings were packed. Arguments spilled into parking lots. Neighbors fought with board members. Emails leaked. Documents surfaced. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, I got a call from Randall. His voice sounded almost amused. Wyatt, he said, I think they're finally realizing how bad this is. What makes you say that? There was a pause. Then he chuckled. Because Victoria just hired her 3rd attorney in 4 days. And that's when I knew the real battle was finally about to begin. By Wednesday afternoon, Victoria showed up at my ranch again. This time, she wasn't alone. A silver sedan followed behind her Range Rover and parked beside the barn. An older man stepped out wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. He carried a leather folder under one arm and looked like a man who hadn't slept much in several days. That was usually a bad sign. for whoever hired him. The wind was moving slowly across the pasture when they walked up to my porch. A few cattle grazed near the eastern fence line. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled overhead. Funny how peaceful the world can look while somebody else's disaster is unfolding. I offered them both a seat. Victoria declined. The attorney accepted immediately. That told me everything I needed to know. The lawyer introduced himself as Michael Barrett. His voice was calm, professional, careful. The kind of voice people use when they know the facts aren't on their side. Mr. Mercer, he began, we'd like to discuss a path toward resolving this situation. Resolving. I almost smiled. A week earlier, they called it a community view restoration project. Now it was a situation. Funny how language changes when consequences arrive. I nodded toward the folder in his lap. Go ahead. Michael glanced briefly at Victoria before speaking. The HOA would like to understand what conditions would satisfy restoration requirements under the easement agreement. There it was. The only question that mattered. I stood up, walked inside, and returned with a folder of my own. Unlike theirs, mine was already prepared. Every document organized. Every estimate printed. Every requirement reviewed by attorneys. Because while they were busy managing a crisis, I'd spent the last several days planning an outcome. I handed the folder across the table. Michael opened it. His eyes moved down the first page, then the second, then the third. The longer he read, the quieter he became. Victoria finally lost patience. What is it? He didn't answer immediately. That worried her. It should have. Finally, she grabbed the folder herself, and the explosion came almost instantly. $58,000? Her voice echoed across the porch. I leaned back in my chair. That's the estimate for replacing mature cedar barriers with comparable environmental coverage. You expect us to pay for all of it. You destroyed all of it. She turned another page. Her face got even redder. 20 years of maintenance. Wildlife monitoring. Irrigation systems. Annual inspections. Then she reached the new easement agreement. That was where things got interesting. The old contract will be replaced entirely. The new one included annual access fees adjusted for inflation, 5 years prepaid, additional environmental protections, and one particular clause that seemed to hit Victoria like a freight train. Any construction, landscaping, fencing, grading, painting, or visual modifications occurring within 60 feet of my property line required written approval from me. Absolutely not. She practically threw the papers onto the table. That is insane. I looked at her for a second, then toward the field where workers would soon need to replant hundreds of feet of cedar trees. You know what's insane, Victoria? She crossed her arms. What? Hiring contractors to enter somebody else's property before sunrise and destroy 15 years of work because you didn't like the view. The silence that followed felt heavy. Michael cleared his throat. He kept reading. Then he reached the final section. The penalty clause. $10,000 per day for future violations involving protected buffer zones. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. The reaction of a man discovering exactly how expensive arrogance can become. Victoria looked genuinely stunned. You cannot seriously be considering this. For the first time all afternoon, Michael looked directly at her. And what happened next might be my favorite moment in the entire story. His expression wasn't angry, wasn't frustrated. It was tired. The look of someone who had spent several days explaining reality to a client who didn't want to hear it. Victoria, he said quietly, you authorize contractors to remove protected environmental barriers connected to a conditional easement. She opened her mouth. He kept going. The documentation exists. The photographs exist. The notices exist. The county records exist. Another pause. Then came the sentence that effectively ended the discussion. We are no longer choosing between good options. We are choosing between expensive options and catastrophic options. Nobody spoke. Not for several seconds. The wind moved through the pasture. A screen door creaked somewhere behind the barn. One of the cows let out a low grunt. Then Victoria looked down at the paperwork. And for the first time since I'd met her, she looked small. Not powerless. Just human. A person realizing that confidence isn't the same thing as control. Eventually, she picked up a pen. Her hand hesitated. Then she signed. Just like that. The war was over. Over the next few weeks, Crews arrived carrying mature cedar transplants on massive flatbed trucks. Some of those trees were actually larger than the originals. I inspected every delivery personally, every species, every placement, every spacing measurement. Not because I wanted revenge, because if somebody was paying to fix what they broke, it was getting fixed correctly. The HOA covered the entire bill. The irrigation systems, the maintenance contracts, the wildlife monitoring, everything. And the funniest part? A few months later, residents started praising the new barrier. Property damage dropped. Wildlife intrusions nearly disappeared. The neighborhood became quieter, safer, more private. Turns out the thing they hated had been helping them all along. As for Victoria, she never really recovered politically. The next HOA election wasn't even close. Homeowners were still angry about the delays, the expenses, and the embarrassment. She lost by a landslide. Last I heard, she sold her house the following year. I've never confirmed whether that's true. Small towns produce a lot of rumors. Some are accurate, some aren't. These days, life is mostly back to normal. The cattle still wander the same pastures. The barn still needs paint. The wind still rattles old fence posts at night. And every now and then I'll sit on the porch around sunset with a cup of coffee and look toward those cedar trees standing taller than ever. What sticks with me isn't the money, or the legal victory, or even the satisfaction of watching somebody face consequences. It's how completely avoidable the whole thing was. Because if Victoria had simply walked across the property line one afternoon and said, "Hey Wyatt, some residents are concerned about the view. Could we talk about it?" There's a good chance we would have figured something out. Maybe we'd trim a section. Maybe we'd thin a few branches. Maybe we'd disagree and leave it at that. Who knows? But conversation would have cost almost nothing. Control cost millions. And honestly, that's the lesson I keep coming back to. A lot of people confuse authority with ownership. They think having influence means having rights over things that don't belong to them. Sometimes they wrap it in phrases like community standards, property values, neighborhood improvements. But underneath all the fancy language, it's usually the same old story. Someone deciding their comfort matters more than someone else's boundaries. The problem is reality doesn't care how important you think you are. Contracts don't care. Nature doesn't care. Consequences definitely don't care. So now I'm curious what you think. Was I justified in shutting down access until the damage was repaired? Or should I have taken a softer approach once the neighborhood started suffering from Victoria's decision? And what about the homeowners who got caught in the middle? Were they victims of bad leadership? Or should they share responsibility for empowering an HOA board that spent years trying to control property beyond its boundaries? Let me know down in the comments, because I've heard strong argument from both sides, and honestly, even all these years later, people still can't seem to agree on where justice ended and revenge began.